A very good afternoon to everybody that is tuning in. This is Midday Express with KURHULA MKANSI, giving you the latest news update during your lunch hour. And now we're heading on to the headlines of the afternoon. The opposition parties ridicule Minister Mbowene's budget speech. Niger's ruling party candidate is declared the winner. Ghana becomes the first recipient of WHO vaccine sharing scheme. And the gang violence blamed after this simultaneous riots in 3 Ecuadorian prisons, and the golf legend Tiger Woods hospitalized following a major car accident. And moving on to the first story this afternoon, the tabling of the much anticipated budget speech by the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has been criticized severely by opposition parties who lambasted Mboweni and the government for failing to provide initiatives backed by actions that could help country's economy. Economy freedom fighters says there is more that needs to be done by the government. Dr. Mbuyiseni Ndlozi says the government needs to create initiatives that will allow money to be spent in a way that will provide positive returns to ensure sustainability.
Well, the budget is a poor attempt which is not going to result in any structural reforms of the South African economy. What are these structural conditions of the South African economy? Is that majority of the wealth and economic activity benefits white people, the fact that there is chronic and rising unemployment that has characterized South Africa's economy for more than 3 decades. Nothing in the budget is going to change that reality. There is nothing or no promise that is going to result in more localization of production happening. So it is basically cognitive dissonance, the terrible attitude that the ANC government suffers of doing the same thing which does not work, and they keep doing it even if presented with evidence that it doesn't work. They insist on doing it. There was no mention at all of illicit financial flows, how you're going to deal with that. There's a lot of tax that is being drained by big corporations through all types of illegal activities. It's not just the tobacco industry. You're talking big corporations like mine, in the mining industry, as well as auditing firms that are facilitating illicit financial flows out of the continent and out of South Africa. There's nothing in the budget that's going to result in a job for young black people tomorrow. There's nothing in the budget that is going to have us have any new economic activity. They are trying to go back to a pre-COVID-19 reality, which is basically no longer tenable.
South Africa is defined by a huge crisis of poverty, of unemployment, and of huge inequalities. The crisis of unemployment is even much deeper because during the lockdown period, an additional 2 million South Africans who were working before lost their jobs, meaning that we have got close to 11 million people in South Africa currently that do not have jobs. The most backward thing any minister can ever do under these conditions is to implement austerity measures, which are budget cuts, because such is going to narrow the revenue base, is going to deepen poverty, is not going to create the necessary jobs that we need to get out of the poverty crisis. So what we think should happen as the economic freedom fighters is that National Treasury must use its current regulatory power to localize procurement, meaning that a minimum of 80% of the goods and services that the state consumes and procures must be made in South Africa. In that way, we are going to be able to create sustainable and dependable jobs for millions of South Africans who are currently jobless. So we hope that the budget is going to move towards localization, implement the localization that has been spoken about on several occasions and has never found a clearer and cogent policy expression. So this must be the beginning of localization as part of reindustrializing South Africa, of building sectors that are going to create jobs for our people. That is our position.
You're so right, Richard. The budget so often contains all of these confusing terms and very big numbers that go over the heads of many South Africans. But actually, the budget is critical to understanding what's happening in our country, sometimes even more critical than what happens in the State of the Nation speech. And this week, we launched a graphic in the DA to try and get the point home to every family about just how bad our debt situation in South Africa is. And just down the road from us where we are here is KURHULA Hospital, where today a whole lot of beautiful little babies, new South Africans, are being born. And they are being born with 67,000 rands worth of our national debt on their shoulders before they've even taken their first breath. And that means guaranteed higher taxes in the future and generally a poorer society all around. And that is wrong. And so what we're saying is that this budget has got to address our national debt crisis. That's the biggest problem. We are 4 trillion rand in debt. What that means for you and I is that that's gobbling up more and more of the budget and more of the taxes, so we pay interest on the debt. And that leaves less for basic services like education and healthcare and the things that all of us really need, infrastructure for a growing economy. That is what we've got to fix in South Africa, and that's what the minister's got to do on Wednesday in his budget.
But why are we so deep in debt?
Well, for years, we've just been spending way more than we earn. And just like that cannot work in any household, it cannot work for the country. You've got to live within your means. You can spend a little bit extra for a little time, so long as you're spending it on good things like infrastructure, building new roads and ports
On the other hand, the Democratic Alliance also tabled its own proposal that included stopping tax hikes and seizing of state-owned entities' bailouts. The DA says government's continued tax hike is hitting hard in the poor and could result in serious filling and increase of criminal activities.
We've just finished the budget speech here in Parliament behind me. And the DA can't help but feel disappointed by what we heard from the minister today, and also by what we didn't hear. Firstly, we are actually, for the first time that I can recall, seeing cuts in the social welfare, social grants budget, which means that at the same time as that we are getting more bailouts for SAA, Eskom and the Land Bank, those are being paid for by the very poorest and most vulnerable in our society by lower social grants or increases in those grants which are way below inflation, so real decreases. Secondly, the minister said that he wasn't going to increase taxes, but actually we saw 27 cents per litre increase in the fuel tax. What that means is that if you get to work on a taxi or on a bus, those fares are going to go up.
And now we take a look at how other parties also reacted.
Don't worry. Firstly, the minister has been consistent that he believes that we have reached a point of inflection as far as the standard taxes are, and that increasing those taxes will not necessarily yield more revenue and also will have a negative effect on the economy. So the minister has been consistent. So today's announcement to reduce by 1% is in line with the trend the minister announced a year ago. Secondly, he also has said that has to go hand in hand with base broadening and addressing some of those abuses. So we work hand in hand with the policy to create the additional revenue from more effective collection than simply hiking the rates. The 40 billion that the minister has now postponed is in response. When we planned it a year ago, we didn't know that the pandemic would be as devastating as it was. It would be unwise not to respond to that. And so leaving that 40 billion in the economy for now has a helpful multiplier effect for jobs and consumption, and then signposting that a year from now a further reduction will come gives the market certainty about directionally where the minister is going. So we are not concerned because we believe there is still a lot of room to improve the efficiency of collection, and we can bring about, and that's why the 3 billion today additional announcement for additional skills, for deepening our capability for AI, machine learning, by expanding and increasing the use of data, and also building our technology platform. All of those things will help us to be more efficient in our collection and takes the burden off the minister to just look at the rates.
To some extent, a very measured budget. It's got both things that we appreciate and also things that we are very much concerned about. For example, the fact that there will be 11 billion that will be allocated for government youth employment and also the 4 billion that will go to local economy. Those were the things that the IFP actually expected, and the fact that there will be no tax increases, we appreciate that very much. But on the other side, there's something that are very concerned that the Minister mentioned, but in a very low tone. The issue of government debt, which is forever increasing. Now it's going for over 5 trillion. The issue of the wage bill, which is a serious problem. And we were also surprised that the minister didn't speak much about the issue of SOEs. Yet we know for a fact that there will be monies that will be allocated to state-owned entities like South African Airways, but they chose not to say anything about that. So those are the things that we are worried about. But in all honesty, he was very measured, and we appreciate him in the fact that the grants will be increased, but that is not much money because he spoke about 10 rands here, 10 rands there, 8 rands here, 8 rands there, which is not much of a money. So, but at the end of the day, half a loaf and no bread.
Do you trust the fact that we are going to get a surplus in 2025, just like the minister has promised?
We only hope, as he spoke about hope, because unless government puts so much emphasis in terms of people accounting, then it's only then, and if we do not keep all these inefficiencies that he spoke about, inefficient local government, in almost all spheres of government, there are fruitless expenditures, there are wasteful expenditures because of people who are in the system, but who shouldn't be there. And also when it comes to the wage bill, they are proposing that there should be some salary cuts, of which we oppose as IFP. We're only saying that let them do the audit and see that those departments that are overstaffed, they transfer staff to those departments that are actually understaffed. If there are new vacancies, they must look from within to see how can they place.
And moving on to the next story, Niger's ruling party candidate was declared the winner of a presidential runoff on Tuesday in an election that is meant to bring about the country's first ever democratic transition of power. But the opposition was alleged widespread fraud. The election kicked off on Saturday last week, and the official results are expected to be released on Friday. The opposition party says the government did not provide full transparency on the election. However, it did not confirm whether it will be challenging the outcome. Let's take a look.
Niger's ruling party candidate has been declared the winner of a presidential runoff, though his opponent has alleged fraud and opposition supporters are lighting fires in the streets. The Electoral Commission said on Tuesday that Mohamed Bazoum won 55.75% of the vote, results that will need to be ratified by the Constitutional Court. It's an election that's meant to bring about Niger's first democratic transition from one leader to another, with President Mahamadou Issoufou stepping down after 2 5-year terms. But shortly before the results were announced, the campaign of former President Mahamadou Usman alleged widespread fraud, including the theft and stuffing of ballot boxes and threats against voters. No evidence was provided. Usman's spokesperson Falke Basharou said nothing can oppose the will of the people, and he urged Nigerians to mobilise. Supporters of the former president, who was ousted in a 1996 coup, have heeded that call. Protesters burned tyres outside Usman's campaign headquarters and in other parts of the capital, Niamey. Police fired tear gas to disperse them. The Electoral Commission has not yet commented on the allegations of irregularities.
And now we move on to our next story. And the World Health Organization's vaccine sharing scheme delivered its first doses on Wednesday as a plane carrying the AstraZeneca vaccine touched down in Ghana. The vaccine is part of the initiative by the WHO to share the vaccine with the countries that do not have the full financial capacity to accumulate the vaccine. Let's take a look.
The World Health Organization's global vaccine sharing scheme delivered its first shots on Wednesday as a race to protect the world's poorest people accelerates. A flight carrying 600,000 doses of AstraZeneca vaccine arrived in Ghana's capital Accra, the WHO and UNICEF said in a joint statement, kick-starting a campaign that Ghanaian health officials said would prioritise frontline health workers and others at high risk of infection. COVAX was launched in June to prevent poorer countries from being pushed to the back of the queue for COVID-19 vaccines. Nevertheless, wealthier nations have since bought up billions of doses and forged ahead with mass immunisation campaigns. COVAX wants to close a politically sensitive gap by delivering 1.8 billion free vaccines to less developed economies, with the aim of inoculating up to 20% of those countries' populations. That's not enough, however, to achieve herd immunity. And on Tuesday, WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus urged wealthier nations to share their vaccines, saying that the goal of equitable distribution was in jeopardy.
210 million doses of vaccine have been administered globally, but half of those are in just 2 countries.
According to a Reuters tally, Ghana has suffered more than 80,000 infections and 580 deaths. Africa's reported death toll passed 100,000 last week, a fraction of those on other continents, but rising fast as a second wave of infections overwhelms hospitals. COVAX said this month that it had allocated the first tranche of 330 million doses of vaccines for 145 countries, including several in West.
And now we move on to some international stories, starting off with the U.S. President Joe Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sought on Tuesday to turn the page on the Trump era, stressing their countries' deep ties and pledging to work together on the counteract Chinese influence and address climate change. After talking for about 2 hours, the two leaders emerged and said they plan to work closely together to beat the COVID-19 pandemic and combat climate change with a goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Trudeau also thanked Biden for reiterating U.S. supporting for the release of 2 Canadians held by China, Michael Spavor and Michael Krovic. Biden and Trudeau did not take questions after delivering their remarks. Let's take a look.
G7.
U.S. President Joe Biden held his first bilateral meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Tuesday, where climate change and China took center stage. Seeking to turn the page on former U.S. President Donald Trump's unorthodox foreign policy, Biden reiterated his commitment to the U.S.-Canada relationship and pledged to work together on achieving net zero emissions by 2050.
We also doubled down on our efforts to tackle climate change. It was really encouraging. Now that the United States is back in the Paris Agreement, we intend to demonstrate our leadership in order to spur other countries to raise their own ambitions. Canada and the United States are going to work in lockstep to display the seriousness of our commitment at both home and abroad.
Trudeau also thanked Biden for the U.S.'s support, calling for the release of 2 Canadians detained by China, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. They were arrested by Beijing in 2018 on espionage charges after Canada's detention of the chief financial officer of Huawei on a U.S. arrest warrant. The bilateral meeting comes shortly after Biden irritated Canada by blocking the multi-million-dollar Keystone XL oil pipeline project and proposing a Buy American program aimed at directing U.S. spending toward domestic manufacturers. But both leaders made clear they wanted to put the dispute behind them and strengthen their alliance.
And now moving on to our next international story. Top executives at Texas-based software company SolarWinds Corp and Microsoft Corp and cybersecurity firm FireEye Inc. and CrowdStrike Holdings Inc. defend their conduct in breaches blamed on Russian hackers and sought to shift responsibility elsewhere in testimony to a U.S. Senate panel. One of the worst hacks yet discovered had an impact on all 4. SolarWinds and Microsoft programs were used to attack others, and the hack struck up at about 100 U.S. companies and 9 federal agencies. Lawmakers started the hearing by criticizing Amazon representatives who they said were invited to testify and whose surveys were used to launch cyber attack for declining to attend the hearing. Let's take a look.
Preliminary indications suggest that the scope and scale of this incident are beyond any that we've confronted as a nation and its implications are significant.
Senator Mark Warner of the Select Committee on Intelligence on Tuesday chaired the panel's first hearing on the massive hack of U.S. government agencies and private companies that was discovered in December. Top executives from Microsoft, CrowdStrike, FireEye, and SolarWinds, whose software was hijacked to breach other companies, said the cyber attack was likely worse than previously thought.
This was an act of recklessness, in my opinion.
Microsoft President Brad Smith said the true scope of the hack is still unknown because most victims are not legally required to disclose information about it, and he appealed for government help.
We do need to enhance the sharing of threat intelligence.
But CrowdStrike CEO George Kurtz, whose cybersecurity firm is helping SolarWinds recover from the breach, turned the blame on Microsoft, calling its complicated architecture, quote, antiquated.
Notably, the threat actor took advantage of systemic weaknesses in the Windows authentication architecture, allowing it to move laterally within the network as well as between the network and the cloud by creating false credentials, impersonating legitimate users, and bypassing multi-factor authentication.
Amazon Web Services was also invited to testify, but the company declined to attend the hearing, irking the senators on the panel, including Florida's Marco Rubio.
Apparently, they were too busy.
The massive breach, which has widely been blamed on Russian hackers, is one of the worst cyber attacks and U.S. intelligence failures on record, affecting at least 9 federal agencies and more than 100 U.S. companies, including all 4 that participated in Tuesday's hearing.
And now we're moving on to some news about the money. Lloyds Banking Group's outgoing Chief Executive Antonio Horta Ocio set out fresh targets to expand the lender's insurance and wealth business after cut costs as the bank resumed a dividend despite a sharp fall in profits for 2020. Britain's biggest domestic lender reported pre-tax profits of £1.2 billion, well down on £4.4 billion the previous year after pandemic lockdowns shrank household spending and drove up provisions for bad loans. But it still beat the average of analyst forecast of £905 million. The strategy update showed Lloyds aimed to offset pressure on profits, including from water-thin central bank interest rates, by easing costs further and increasing income from fee-based products such as wealth management and corporate banking. Let's take a look.
Lloyds Banking Group has a plan to restore profitability. It's going to take advantage of the trend for working at home and slash office space. The lender plans to reduce its total footprint by 1/5 within 3 years. The move comes after a big plunge in full-year earnings. On Wednesday, the bank reported pre-tax profits of $1.7 billion. That was less than 1/3 of the previous year's level, though it still beat analyst forecasts. The bank blamed mounting bad loans, which forced it to set aside billions of pounds to cover possible defaults. To turn things around, the firm is investing in its insurance and wealth management operations, as well as aiming to cut costs. Wednesday also saw bleak numbers from rival Metro Bank, which saw losses multiply. It too warned that loan defaults would mount in the months ahead as government support for businesses winds down. As for office space, commercial property firms will be watching developments with alarm. Earlier in the week, bigger rival HSBC said it would cut its offices by 40%.
And now moving on to our next story. Digital health checks will be vital to a recovery in the foreign travel from the COVID-19 pandemic, Britain's Heathrow Airport said on Wednesday. Let's take a look.
It's a flashback to years past. Britain's Heathrow Airport saw passenger numbers fall 73% last year to levels not seen since the 1970s. It said Wednesday it plunged to a $2.8 billion annual loss due to the global health crisis. 22 million people travelled through the airport, half of those in the first 2 months of the year before most global lockdowns. Heathrow also lost its title as the busiest airport in Europe to Paris, as its flight schedules contracted more than its rivals. Now the London hub is desperate to get passengers back in the skies and has called on the UK government to help out. The airport wants rapid digital health checks to replace the current paper-based system, and it's called for business tax breaks for big airports. Now there is some cause for optimism at Heathrow, which is just outside the capital. It hopes travel markets will reopen from mid-May after the British government announced lockdown restrictions would be eased during the coming months.
And now moving on to our next story. Hyundai Motor Co. will replace battery system in some 82,000 electric vehicles globally due to the first risks, a costly $900 million. Recall that lays bare the thorny issue of how car and battery make split the bill when problems arise. The recall is one of the first mass battery pack replacement conducted by a major automaker. The recall mostly concerns the Kona EV, Hyundai's biggest selling electric car, which was first recalled last year for a software upgrade after a spate of fires. One of the recall Kona EVs caught fire in January, however, and South Korean authorities launched a probe into whether the first recall had been adequate. LG Energy Solutions, a division of LG Chem Ltd, which manufactures the batteries, was quick to deflect criticism. It said in a statement that Hyundai misapplied LG's suggestion for the fast charging logic in the battery management system, adding the battery cell should not be seen as the direct cause of the fire risk. Let's take a look.
Hyundai Motor is set to replace the batteries in some 82,000 electric vehicles over risks they could catch fire. Combined with an earlier recall, the problem looks set to cost the automaker about $900 million. The latest move mainly applies to its best-selling EV, the Kona. It was first recalled in October for a software upgrade after a series of fires. But in January, one of the upgraded cars then caught fire, prompting South Korean authorities to probe whether the first recall was adequate. The unit of LG Chem which makes the battery said Hyundai had misapplied its suggestions regarding battery management. It said the batteries themselves were not the fire risk. There have been 15 cases of fires involving the Kona EV. Most were in South Korea, but there were 2 in Canada and 1 each in Finland and Austria. Hyundai Motor shares were down close to 4% in afternoon trade on Wednesday.
And that was all that I had for you this afternoon on Midday Express on channel 500 on Galaxy Universal Network. And now, thank you for tuning in with us. From me and Galaxy Universal Network, we say goodbye.